We have a lot of people now.
Yep. Probably.
Yeah. I will, get it started.
And we get calls. Calls every day. We have employees. We don't want them there.
Is it ready to go?
It is, yep, we're good.
It's like,
All right.
Hello and welcome, everyone. We have you'll see we have a new gadget with us today at the center table. That's Mr. Owl. And there are folks attending remotely on the Owl. And so, we're gonna go around and introduce ourselves, I think, just so we have a sense of who's here in, on the recording. It's captured as to who's here in person, and then I'll ask the folks that are on the, that are hearing remotely to introduce themselves as well. And one of the other things that we're gonna ask everybody to do as they're here today, both the council and anyone in the audience, from the public who wants to provide comments, if you will say your name before you speak, please, each time. It makes it easier for the recording so that, we're not trying to decipher whose voice that sounds like and perhaps getting it wrong. So, I'll start out. I'm Christy Beal. I'm here in person.
Maggie Schmidt, I'm here in person.
Steve Hill, I'm here in person.
Clay Taylor.
Hi, I'm Bill Schenk with Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks.
I'm Margie Christensen, and I'm here in person. Billy Galatzky.
And then if staff would like to introduce.
Yeah, Doug Martin with the Natural Resource Damage Program.
Miranda Flutie, Natural Resource Damage Program.
Brian Becker with the Natural Resource Damage Program. Jim Ford with NRD.
Sydney Stewart with NRD.
Nathan Cook, Natural Resource Damage Program. Kenny, NRDP.
Ray Vinke, NRDP.
That's all staff, but we might as well have the rest of the public introduced while you're here.
Yes. Amanda Cooley, Powell County.
Andy Fisher with the Select Fork Coalition. Carl Hammock with Anaconda Jones County.
Thank you all. And if the folks who are appearing remotely, would you mind please introducing yourselves as well?
I'll go. John Ramosko with the Board of Investments.
Thank you.
Seth Makepeace with the Sales Kootenai Tribes.
Thank you. Is there anyone else remotely?
Yes, Valerie Kurth with the Department of Natural Resources and Conservation.
Morgan
Sean
Case,
Connors representing Grand Cours Ranch.
Morgan Case with Trout Unlimited.
Thank you. Do we have anyone else appearing remotely? All right, so with this new meeting, we're gonna have some new rules just to make sure the recording goes well. So if somebody wants to make a comment, if you just indicate to me so I can recognize and I'll have you state your name. All right, turn it over to Doug.
All right, thank you, Chris. This is Doug Martin. Just a quick run through of the agenda. We do have a pretty full agenda today. We are presenting our annual update to the council members and the public. Last year, we presented the same information. You provided us with some feedback about how we can make it better. We would ask, and we tried to incorporate that. We tried to incorporate some new ideas to try to make it more readable. There is a lot of information to present. And so if you do have some ideas, we'd be more than interested in hearing your thoughts on how we could make this more presentable, both to you and to the public. So if you have thoughts as we're going through this, maybe jot them down and or say something to the staff after the meeting or something like that. We'd be happy to try to make those happen next year. So
From my preliminary, from looking at it, I want to thank you guys for all your hard work in putting this together because I really liked the context and The table, the visual references, I liked those, so thank you for all of your hard work. Appreciate it.
And so this is the agenda. We're gonna start with the financial update and then work through with the restoration plan updates. We'll end with the Parrot. Jim will provide a Parrot project update, and then I'll end with a discussion of what is on agenda for next year, which is a revision to the aquatic and terrestrial restoration plans that needs to be completed in 2023. With that, if there's no questions, we will kick it off and we'll start with Miranda.
So we're going over the Upper Fork River Basin Restoration Fund financials. We do this by fiscal year, so a reminder that runs July 1st to June 30th. So it'd be July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2020. As a reminder, in the original allocation, there was some errors in math, I guess. So in 2013, we did a backfill with the interest that was put into that date to get to the actual starting balances. So we are looking at Butte groundwater, which earned 0 interest this fiscal year, spent 630,000. There's no general expenses coming out of that, and is over budget by just over 675,000. This is because we didn't factor in for administrative costs when we did the Parrot transfers. We are expecting that the Parrot will have enough remaining budget for the 14% that comes back to cover these expenses. It is important to note that that contract is completing the end of this month, and we don't expect much more trends.
Why was there no interest earned in that account? This is Steve Hill.
Because the way that the interest is calculated, it does it by how much is remaining in the balance and removing what's been spent. So because it's a negative balance, you can't really calculate for the interest it should earn because it's technically not.
Okay.
So moving on to the aquatics, it's earned 1.5 million in interest this year. It's spent 1.7 million. It covers almost 600,000 of the general expenses, revenues, and liabilities, and has a remaining balance of 36.6 million. Terrestrial, earned 152, or just over, or 152,000 in interest. Spent 629 and covers about 60,000 in general expenses, revenues, and liabilities, leaving the fund at 3.7 million. Then you have the aquatic reserves, which earned about 500,000 and is sitting at 12.2 million. And then the terrestrial reserves, which has earned 214,000 in interest and is sitting at 5.2 million. So we're looking at the totals, and this is just the totals of these. So the total interest earned is 2.3 million. Total spent is almost 3 million. General expenses is just under 650,000 and a total balance of 57.1 million. So then we have other encumbered funds. That includes the grants, which has a balance of 4.3 million. Dutchman, which has a balance of 1.5. Milltown has 40,000. And the total encumbered funds remaining is 6.25 million, which leaves this entire fund balance at 63.4 million. And the Savers fund balance is 70,000. Or sorry, 70 million. So, we do have a handout in the packets that explains this in detail. I'm not going to go into it, but just a brief explanation of why there's a difference between the Savers fund balance and the cash and invested cash balance is because Savers includes some non-cash items which cannot be calculated need to be excluded to determine how much money is actually available to spend in the fund. And then a brief overview of some of our other funds that we manage. Area 1 had revenue / interest of 252,000, expenses of 466,000, and is sitting at 5.9 million. The Clark Fork River offerable unit has revenue interest of 746,000, expenses of 1.8 million this year, and is sitting at 25.7 million. Smelter Hill Uplands earned 248,000 in interest, 233,000 in expenses, and has a remaining balance of 8.7 million. The Parrot earns 31,000 in interest, 5.4 million in expenses, and 7.2 million remains. And then the CFWIP fund earns 5,000 in interest, 463,000 in expenses, and 1.2 million remaining. So, yeah. Any questions?
Anyone from the council have any questions? Anyone from the public have any questions? For those of you on OWL, when I open it for questions like this, that includes you too. All right. Thank you, Miranda.
So this is Doug Martin. We're going to start the update and go over the aquatic and terrestrial projects in the plan in the annual update there. This is one of the improvements. This next slide shows one of the improvements of information that we are going to provide and some feedback we got. And this is in your packet. I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here. So this is for the aquatic priority areas. And what this does is this lists all of the watersheds that we're working in. And we can look at Cottonwood Creek here. Cottonwood Creek is right below Silverbow Creek. It shows the original balance that was allocated in 2012. And it shows the total balance that was in the total allocation. There's also a column in 2018 because we did allocate funding in 2018. Much like we'll do next year, we will allocate available interest or available funds to additional priorities. But it also shows how much we have spent on this watershed. So for instance, in Cottonwood Creek, and Nathan will talk about Cottonwood Creek specifically later. It talks about how much has been spent in Cottonwood Creek and also how much is remaining. So there's a little over $1 million remaining in Cottonwood Creek. So this spreadsheet will be important. One, it provides information for you if you want to know how much we've spent, but it'll also be important when we start the revision, when you're looking at where do we want to allocate funding to, what watersheds or what priority area, and actually how much money has been spent in those areas and remains to be spent in those areas. So we provided this cost sheet for all of the areas. Actually, it's very similar to the table 6 in the back of the restoration plan. So there's aquatic flow, the main stem, Clark Fork, also all of the terrestrial areas, as well as the recreational areas. So that's just a brief overview of what those spreadsheets are providing. We did send those out a little later. They weren't in the packet. We sent those out after the packet was sent out. I will turn it over to Sydney now to go over the spreadsheet that she put together. And actually introduce the projects.
Hi, I'm Sydney. I'm a project manager with NRDP. I'm just going to give a refresher on the background, some of the goals of the restoration plan and the project we're working on. First, we wanted to start by acknowledging all of our project partners. We couldn't do all the work in the basin without help from all these people. So a lot of our projects are on private land, which involves working with landowners and water users. And then groups like Clark Fork Coalition, Trout Unlimited, and the Watershed Restoration Coalition help us work with those landowners and see projects through to completion. And then other entities like the tribes state agencies, federal agencies, and city and county governments, all help us get these projects done. So these are the 3 goals for aquatic resources in the restoration plan. Restore the main stem trout fishery, replace lost trout angling, and maintain or improve native trout populations. We put these projects in priority tributary watersheds. So these tributaries were prioritized by FWP, and this guides where we implement our projects. We have 5 main project types for aquatic resources. So flow augmentation, which Brian will talk about soon, and then fish entrainment, fish passage, riparian habitat, and in-stream habitat, which Nathan will talk about later. And then jumping to terrestrial. So the terrestrial restoration goals are focused on restoring and replacing the injured resources and their services. We similarly have priority terrestrial areas. These areas were prioritized by FWP, and these guide where we implement terrestrial projects. And project types for terrestrial resources fall into 2 categories. We have lands projects, which are acquisitions and easements, and then habitat enhancement projects. So enhancing different types of terrestrial habitats. And Ray will talk about this later too. So as Doug said, part of the things we've added to the packet are these update tables or summary tables. There's a lot of information in them, so we wanted to just walk through them briefly and give you a little introduction. This is the aquatics table. It's the most complicated one. It's meant to be sort of a summary overview of all the projects that we're working on, and it should tie back to the packet where there's narrative updates for each project. So it's organized by priority watershed, which is the same as the organization in the packet. And then each project listed here should have a paragraph, at least in the packet, with a narrative update. Ones that are highlighted yellow have an update in 2022, and ones that are highlighted green were completed in 2022. The next couple columns are restoration actions. This is kind of a brief summary on the project type. So for example, the McQuarrie Ranch has a fish passage and fish entrainment project. And then the next column is project status. So a filled circle here means the project is complete. A circle with a line through it means the project is in progress. So it's being designed or it's in construction or something like that. And then an open circle is a conceptual project. So we might still be working on determining what kind of project or gauging landowner interest or things. The next column is project performance monitoring. So this means that someone went out to the project, a completed project, to make sure it's still there, still functioning and working towards achieving the restoration goals. So an X in this column means that NRDP or one of our project partners went out to the project in 2022 to make sure that it's still there and functioning. This NA is for projects that aren't complete yet, so it's not applicable to go out and do monitoring. And then TBP is our abbreviation for to be performed. So this is a project that was completed in 2022, and next year we'll go out and do monitoring. And then a blank cell here would indicate that there's no monitoring. But these 4 kind of categories will follow through on the rest of the columns. So the next one is fish monitoring, and Nathan will talk a lot more about this, but just as a brief introduction, FWP does fish monitoring at 3 different levels. So there's the basin level, which is various points throughout the main stem, Clark Fork and Silverbow Creek. And then there's watershed monitoring, so various points throughout each watershed. And then project monitoring, where they're monitoring fish around one specific project. So again, an X in these columns mean that in 2022, FWP monitored fish at that level in that area. But FWP doesn't do monitoring in every watershed and every project every single year. Some of them are every other year or every 3 to 5 years or something. So we added this asterisk to indicate that it wasn't monitored in 2022, but it is part of the overall monitoring plan. And then again, TBP is to be performed for projects that were recently completed. And then the final column is O&M, so operations and maintenance. Again, in X, there was operations and maintenance done in 2022, NAs for projects that aren't complete yet, and TBP, it will be done in the future. And then the terrestrial table is the same. Fisheries monitoring is not applicable, so those columns aren't here. And then we split it into the two different project types. So we have lands projects and then habitat enhancement projects. And I don't know if you can really see it on the screen, but these columns are grayed out for lands projects because those habitat enhancement project types aren't relevant to land projects, and then vice versa for the habitat projects. And the reason we split those up is because sometimes we have areas with both. So the Clark Fork River Ranch had a land project. It also has habitat enhancement projects, and those are at different stages. So we wanted to be able to show you where each of those projects are at. And then the recreation is the simplest one, just project status, monitoring, and maintenance. And so I'll just echo what Doug said. If you guys have any feedback on how we can make these tables more useful, please let us know. And then I'll give it to Brian.
So, Kay, did you have a question? This is Doug.
Yes, and I don't, it's not necessarily specific to this last table on the screen, but throughout the tables, I think I've looked at all of them. There's all of the projects appear here on the tables, including CFWEP and unallocated funding, et cetera, but I don't see the Greenway listed in any of these tables.
This is Doug, responding. Yeah, Kay, you are correct. The Greenway is not listed and we, for some reason, have never listed it. But that's something that we should include. You're correct.
I'll go ahead and call on Alex. Alex.
I think these tables are super helpful and I appreciate it. Just one quick question. Would there be any way, you guys have the funding allocated by drainage? Would there be any way to see the funding allocation by project as well?
Essentially what that, sorry, this is random. That's sort of what that spreadsheet is, but we don't.
So, yeah, we could probably pull that for you, Alex, if you had a specific request on it, but we've allocated the funding per watershed, and that's how we're managing those funds per watershed on priority projects, but if you had a specific project you wanted to see how much we spent on it, we probably could pull that.
We just don't track that at that level, so you would have to ask one of the project people and they could pull that number. Miranda, it's not tracked on that level for Miranda, our financial folks to pull for you.
Each project has an allocation.
Yes.
This is Steve Hill. Okay.
Yeah, Miranda, again, we do keep budget trackers for each project, or at least each project. Essentially, we have each project under a contract or a task order, so we do have a budget for each of those. But within our accounting system, that does not track those by project, just because of how the accounting has to be done. It's basically just by the allocation.
Any other questions? I did notice that CFREP has an online auction going, so if you want to bump that fund balance up to like 1.3 million, you should probably bid on something today.
Introduce.
Oh, I'm Brian Barkoyak, another project manager with the Natural Resource Damage Program. And I get to present the Aquatic Flow project updates. Just a recap of our priority areas. Our priority is getting more water in the main stem Clark Fork, mainly between Warm Springs and Deer Lodge. Second in priority are priority watersheds within the injured areas. And third in priority are priority watersheds outside the injured areas. Just to give you an overview, these aren't all our monitoring locations, but these will be the ones I'm talking about today. On the main stem Clark Fork, in order from upstream, downstream, Clark Fork at Galen Gauge, Clark Fork at Galen Road, and just keep in mind that those are actually two different locations. Clark Fork at Gemback Road, Clark Fork at Sager Lane, and Clark Fork at Deer Lodge. And then the one tributary I'll talk a little bit about today is Warm Springs Creek below the Gardner Ditch. The next series of graphs are going to be very similar. On the x-axis on the left-hand side, you're going to have flow. X-axis, right-hand side, you're going to have temperature. Across the bottom is going to be the dates that we're looking at going through the water year. This is the Clark Fork at the Galen gauge, it's the USGS gauge, and this is just kind of showing you what we saw this year in terms of flow. It was kind of unique that we had a very low flow leading into spring runoff. We usually have a little bit of a runoff before we get to a peak. And then we had, as everybody knows, we had some good spring rains. We actually had a pretty normal peak flow. But then it seemed like July, the rain and precipitation kind of just shut off. And fairly quickly, we got to some pretty low flow conditions with flows below our target's flows, and also pretty warm water temperatures where water temperatures exceeding thresholds that are harmful to trout. This is the farthest upstream gauge on the Clark Fork, and as you go downstream, looking at the USGS gauge at Deer Lodge, you see kind of the same things, a little more exaggerated. Again, we had low flows, pretty normal runoff, but again, we've had a significant 47 days above our target flows and about 54 days above temperature targets. So filling in that data with some of the data our partners collect, namely Andy, it's not only the number of days, but also the magnitude. Looking at these stations are between Galen and Deer Lodge, and not only did not achieve our target flows, we were pretty significantly below, about 20 CFS in the river between Galen and Deer Lodge, which is pretty low. Our targets are 50 compared to the yellow line, 60 compared to the green line. So we're pretty far between them. Not only, again, is it flow problems, but temperature problems too. So we've had, looking at those gauges in between, some significant days and some significant temperature above our criteria. This is the data collected from Morgan with TU. This is looking at Warm Springs Creek. We did have, keep hitting the wrong button, some flows below our targets, but you can see the water coming into the Clark Fork is colder. And, that's kind of the goal of our flow program, is improving flows into the main stem, and not only flows, but temperature. It's not all gloom and doom. Looking at one gauge, where we've implemented the majority of our in-stream flow changes, was the only area that we've actually achieved flow targets for the season. So this is at Galen Road. Comparing it to the downstream flow target, we stayed above that target throughout the whole season this year. And then talking about some of our projects, the in-stream flow changes that our partners have helped us complete have mainly focused in the upper river. So we're probably seeing some effects of those changes with meeting targets at our gauges. So we have project with Dry Cottonwood Creek has over 9 CFS of in-stream flow. We have a flow change in with DNRC for an additional 6 CFS for up to 36 days. And then we are working on a project in coordination with DEQ's cleanup, converting a leaky ditch to a pipeline project in that same area. We're also working on other water edge changes associated with Dry Cottonwood Creek, Racetrack Pond, and thanks to the hard work of the Clark Fork Coalition, after about 12 years, we finally had a release from Racetrack Lake. We did have flows make it all the way down from Racetrack Lake into the Clark Fork, providing some cool water to the main stem. And talking about some of the other projects, of course, this council approved the Rock Creek cattle lease last winter. That was in effect this year. There's a lease moving forward. We've been working with University of Montana and the Clark Fork Coalition, looking at split season leasing study. This is mainly getting people's feedback on what they feel about a split season lease. And then we've been working with the water rights that we own as part of the Clark Fork River Ranch and the other water users on the Valentin ditch to do, we have an in-stream, we basically have a split season lease set up with our, another one of our water users, and we've been in conversations with the third water user about potential split season lease or infiltration in irrigation infrastructure improvements to actually work with all together improving flows late season in the main stem. One of the things that we started last year that we're really happy about and has had a very positive response was a streamflow working group. The mission to pursue solutions that support and balance the needs of the upper Clark Fork River watershed communities. This has been a great group to work with. We have representatives from all the CFC, TU, as well as the local counties, the tribes, state agencies, and we're all working together to try to look at solutions to solve some of the flow problems. We do have a fairly good representation of water users on this group, and it's been really good. We are looking at projects from headwater storage to leveraging some pure reclamation grants to actually stretch some flow dollars a little farther, to water management and split season leases. So that's a project that we've been pretty happy about, and that's just a very, very brief snapshot of what we got going on. There's more information in your packets. I just gave you a very big brief recap of our monitoring data. A lot of our gauges have just been pulled, in October, and TU and CFC is still crunching data and putting reports together, but all the reports are available on our website. And with that, I'd be happy to turn it over to questions.
Council, any questions?
You
Yeah,
would have let me down if you didn't ask questions.
they're not very good sometimes.
This is Steve Hill.
Yeah, Steve Hill. So you monitor the temperature and water flow. Is there reciprocal monitoring for the fish survivability or survival?
Nathan will touch on that when we
Okay.
get there.
Okay.
And who are you?
Packing with NRD. Brian, my question is, do you guys monitor snowpack, and then do you see the percentage of snowpack pretty much follow what you see in for flow in the rivers then? Does that correlate pretty well?
Not really. I like to say I actively monitor snowpack on most weekends throughout the winter. But from what I've seen is snowpack's a good indication of what the water is going to look like in the summer, but is not the only indication. We've had years where there's been a very big snowpack and just a long, slow, drawn off runoff, and have had flow and temperature problems. We've also had years where there's been very little snowpack and it comes out and we have big peak flows, and then we have a very wet, rainy summer that, you don't have those flow and temperature problems. So that's one of the things we look at, but you can't say, like we were talking on the way over here, NPR was talking about how great the snowpack is already. And it's like, that's all well and good, but it's a little early to be looking at snowpack right now. And we should really, it's not only how much snow is up there, but how it comes off in the spring.
Any other questions? Anyone on the owl?
And I will add while I'm up here, if you do have a question on lines, just raise your hand or do something so we can see you and we'll address it.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Got it.
Good afternoon. I'm Nathan Cook, an RDP, and I'm going to be talking today about the aquatics non-flow projects. I'm also going to touch on the fisheries monitoring at the end of my presentation. Again, these are projects going on in the priority tributaries in the Upper Cloud Fork River Basin. There's too many projects to present on them all today, but all that information is in your meeting packet. And of course, we're around to answer any questions on any specific project you might have. So I'm going to highlight today 3 projects I think that are representative of the type of work we did in 2022. We completed construction on one project. That was the phase 2 of the Aspen Grove project in Cottonwood Creek, and I'll talk about that a little bit more on the next slide. But we spent a lot of time in 2022 on designing and developing new projects. The one that I'm going to highlight today is a fish passage project in the Warm Springs Creek watershed related to the Silver Lake infrastructure. And we also spent a lot of time working with our partners on O&M and monitoring on existing projects. So making sure those projects are functioning as designed and working out any issues we might have. And then again, worked a lot on the fisheries monitoring stuff, which I'll cover towards the end. The Aspen Grove Phase 2 project, it was Phase 2 of a fish passage and entrainment project on Cottonwood Creek. Both phases were funded partially by NRCS funds and then restoration funds. And in the Phase 2, combined 2 irrigation ditches, completely eliminated 1 diversion, which improved upstream fish passage, installed a new head gate, put in FCA screen or Farmers Conservation Alliance screen. And then we replaced about 1 mile of leaky irrigation ditch with the pipeline. So there was some flow savings there as well. And then the project I wanted to highlight that's currently in design is, again, fish passage project in the Warm Springs Creek watershed. This project aims to provide upstream fish passage for bull trout past dams, which are currently passage barriers. And these dams are part of UCFRB's water delivery infrastructure to get water out of Silver Lake through this infrastructure. And this project's currently at 90% design. It has pretty extensive permitting requirements that will be on, and working through those permits will be ongoing through 2023. There's a lot of partnerships that go along with this project. And one of the developments in 2022 is our project partner, TU, had come up with matching funds for this project, which may amount to about half of the funding for this project. So we like to see those matching funds. They help us make our restoration dollars go like a lot farther. And then in terms of project that we spent, or I personally spent a lot of time working on O&M, an existing project. I wanted to highlight the Allendale project on Flint Creek. This is a project that was completed in fall of 2021. So I think you may have seen presentations on this project before. But just to remind you, it was a fish screening and diversion project. There's actually 4 different fish screens all on the same site. You can see that in this picture here. Here's a vertical flat plate screen and then 3 we call corrugated fish screens. So 4 different ditches, 4 different screens. And we rebuilt 2 diversions to make them more fish friendly to upstream fish passage. So 2022 was the first full irrigation season for this project. And so along with DNRC, who is our agency project partner, and Trout Unlimited, we work very closely with the water users, making sure they got their water and that the fish screens were functioning and eliminating fish entrainment into those irrigation canals. And then finally, this is one project that I worked real closely with Fish, Wildlife and Parks to do fisheries monitoring. And we work really closely with Fish, Wildlife and Parks on fisheries monitoring through a cooperative agreement. We provide funding to them to monitor how these trout populations are responding to restoration actions. And our progress towards meeting those restoration goals that Sydney mentioned. Those 3 restoration goals that all had the word trout in them. Did you guys notice that? I did. So our restoration goals are very trout centric. So we rely on this monitoring data from FWP as one of the primary ways that we monitor our progress in reaching those goals. But FWP does this monitoring at basically 3 different spatial scales. So at the main stem of the basin scale, that's the Big River, Clark River scale, or the tributary scale, we call that the watershed scale, and then sometimes at the specific project scale. In 2022, we tried to put a lot more focus on the project level monitoring. For the main stem monitoring, again, that's the Clark Fork River, Silver Bow Creek level. FWP has 7 sections that they do trout population estimates on every spring, so annually. And those are spread out throughout the river from Warm Springs down to Bearmouth. And so we have a pretty good data set from this monitoring. And one of the things we've learned is that is what the sources of trout production are to the river. Where do the trout that live in the river, where do they come from? And we've learned that if they come from the main stem itself, they spawn and rear in the main stem itself, and they also spawn and rear in certain tributaries. And those tributaries are the ones that we prioritize for restoration actions. We've also learned that the brown trout population, particularly upstream deer lodge, is highly dependent on flow conditions. And this gets at your question, Steve. So what you're looking at here is a model that I developed a few years back. And so on the y-axis here, the vertical axis, is basically just the number of trout captured in FWP sampling in their most upstream section, they call the pH section. So it's the number of fish captured by FWP. And then on the x-axis, it's minimum flows. But it's not minimum flows during that year that FWP is out there doing their electric fishing. It's minimum flows 3 years before that. So the way I interpreted this model is those minimum flows are important during that fish's first year of life when they're young and they're most vulnerable to those flow conditions, those environmental conditions in the river. And this, to me, this really highlights the importance of those types of flow projects that Brian talked about in terms of maintaining and enhancing the trout population in the main stem Clark Fork River. And I should mention that this is just for brown trout. Brown trout make up about 95% of the total trout species in the upper river. However, in recent years, this relationship between flow and trout numbers is not as strong as it used to be. And going on about 4 to 5 years now, trout population has remained low, even though we've had some pretty decent flow years. So for instance, these years are the year of the survey. So in 2021, we had pretty good flows. 3 years ago in 2018, that pool model predicted we'd have a lot more fish out there. And we did. So FWP was concerned about these low numbers. And so we, along with them, put together a meeting back in February with university professors and students, our NGO partners, pretty much anyone could find that's smart about fish ecology. And one of the things that came out of this meeting is FWP presented a study they did along with the USGS where they looked at brown trout population trends, not just in the Clark Fork River, but throughout Montana. And they found that there's actually a lot of other rivers out there where the brown trout population is following a similar trend to what's going on in the Clark Fork River. Clark Fork River, of course, has its own set of stressors and limiting factors, but it's not just the Clark Fork River where brown trout populations have been down in recent years. And one of the things that came out of their particular study is that repeated drought years, prolonged drought periods, really seem to be hammering the brown trout populations in specific rivers throughout Montana. Now I'm going to move on to the watershed or the tributary monitoring. This is something that FWP did at over 80 sites spread throughout 25 different tributaries for 3 years in a row. And that effort was done to get baseline data on all those populations before we went out and did a whole bunch of restoration projects. And now they're continuing that monitoring, but less frequently, more to keep up the trend data and to see how those trout populations change over time as we do more restoration projects. So this is an example of what that data looks like. On Harvey Creek, in this case, those are 4 different sampling sections on Harvey Creek. On the y-axis, you have trout population numbers, and then x-axis is just over time over different years. And what we've learned looking at this data set is in small watersheds like Harvey Creek, where we've done a whole bunch of different restoration projects. In Harvey Creek, actually, we're done doing restoration there. We've done riparian enhancement there, we've done irrigation improvements, ditch consolidation, both the fish screen and provided in-stream flow. We've seen some responses in the trout population. For instance, this section right here at River Mile 1.6 is directly downstream of the fish screen that was constructed in 2014. And lo and behold, right up that fish screen was put in, we saw an immediate bump in the West Slope cutthroat trout numbers. Those are the blue bars here. And the orange bars are bull trout numbers. And that was another encouraging thing we saw on Harvey Creek is starting to see bull trout recolonizing parts of Harvey Creek in the project area after restoration was completed. So Harvey Creek, the data looks pretty good, but when we look at our data over in larger watersheds, we just don't see these kind of distinct trends. It may take more time, we may need more monitoring data, or we may need to do more restoration projects before we see measurable differences in the trout population in these watersheds. Moving on to the project monitoring. Again, I want to highlight the Allendale project. It's one that I've worked on personally for several years now. And to monitor sort of how fish are interacting with all that new infrastructure out there. FWP has tagged over 1,000 fish in Flint Creek and the Clark Fork River going back since 2015. And they're looking at what happens to those fish. Are they being entrained into irrigation canals? And looking at upstream fish passage as well, particularly in reference to these newly constructed riffles that we put in. So what have we learned from all this monitoring? Well, we've seen native fish come from as far away as the Clark Fork River, so over 12 miles. They've migrated from the Clark Fork River up Flint Creek to spawn. And then 2 of these cutthroat were actually entrained into the Allendale Canal, but the fish screen allowed them to be bypassed back into Flint Creek. We've also seen fish using the new constructed riffles for upstream fish passage. And we're keeping an eye on those riffles though, because the material in some places is a little bit small perhaps, and it's moved around a little bit with high flows. So we're seeing if there's ways we could make upstream fish passage even better there. And we're still studying how fish that are saved by these fish screens, what happens to them after they're returned to the river? Are they contributing to the Flint Creek population as a whole, or maybe even they're contributing to the Clark Fork River trout population? And we're hoping that these kind of data will help us prioritize similar projects in the future and perhaps different watersheds again. We have a very similar study going on in Cottonwood Creek as well, studying the fish screens there as well. And both the Cottonwood Creek and the Flint Creek study will be ongoing at least into 2023. And so I went over the fish monitoring stuff pretty quickly. I don't have a lot of time today, but if you want more details, feel free to contact me. You can also go on FWP's Fish MT website. There's monitoring reports available there. If you enter the keyword Upper Clark Fork there. That's my last slide. If there's any questions on projects or monitoring, I'd be happy to answer them.
I guess I just have a comment and also
to Brian's projects as well as Maggie Schmidt in person. I guess, and this is for all meetings, maybe just a suggestion. I know a lot of these projects are twofold, being there's always a resource goal, but then there's always the talk of you have to have landowner buy-in oftentimes for these projects to even take place. And it seems like the landowner piece kind of gets lost or isn't presented well enough. And as someone who's talking to farmers and ranchers regularly and about these projects, it would be helpful to know a little more, like, what are the outcomes for these landowners? Why are they buying into projects? It makes it easier for us to, as we're involved in those conversations, say, well, like, why would you want to do a project, or why would you want to talk to them about some of these improvements? So I guess that's just one comment I have. It would be helpful sometimes to know why are they buying in? What are they getting out of it? What has the impact been for them as a landowner?
That's a great one.
We can provide that. And this is Doug talking at, for instance, the work that Brian's done on Cottonwood Creek. You know, a lot of the benefits there are, you know, the diversions are fish friendly. They allow fish passage upstream, downstream, and decrease fish entrainment with a screen. You know, the landowners aren't having to operate or put out tarps and manage those. So those are some of the things, but yeah, we can.
I just think that, I don't know if I'm the only one that feels like that, it would be helpful. I'm aware of a lot of what those outcomes are, but I don't know if everyone else is, and for Marjorie, for example, in the ranching community, but yeah, it's really helpful to hear, you know, what those outcomes are, and this labor savings, financial savings, or.
We could highlight that more.
Yeah, I think that'd be
I think
helpful.
it part, you know, if we're talking about monitoring, that's.
Yeah.
Present that as a positive outcome.
Yeah.
And
Oh, go ahead, I'm sorry.
this is Brian. I'll just add on to that response, and thank you, Maggie. I guess I just always focused on the resource benefit, but you know, I didn't even think of people would be interested that the Cottonwood project converted, I don't even know how many acres from flood to pivots, and increased his production as well. I mean, we've always focused on, you know, the resource benefit for this council, but that's a great comment. We'd be happy to add that.
This is Christy Beal. Would there be I mean, thinking about, when I grew up, it was my dad always read the green sheets. Is there, I know that it's a very different world now with electronics, but I also know a lot of ranchers still, there's a certain paper or there's a certain publication that they go to. Would there, for two reasons, one, to say thank you, and also to generate additional communication in that community. Would there be a way, you know, right around Thanksgiving, for example, to say, hey, thank you to these landowners. They did this, and this is how it benefited the resource, but this is how it benefited those landowners too. Sort of as a thank you, but also a marketing and a means by which to get them talking to each other. About, hey, you could do this too on your property.
And I do know a lot of the projects, especially if WRC or NRCS are involved, they are in their newsletter, which most locals receive. But it's not always, they're not always included if they're DNRC or projects.
Good, thank you.
Pete Hill.
When you're constantly collecting fish populations and establishing fish mortality based on flow and temperature, do you do a similar collection on the aquatic and terrestrial insects that are the food source? Could they be impacted by the same conditions? And do you do any health evaluations of the fish that you do on length versus girth?
Let me start with the fish, I guess. The length versus weight relationship is something that we do look at. And interestingly, there's not a big difference in different parts of the river. So from Bearmouth up to Warm Springs, there's not a big difference in weight at length, which is our condition factor there. So FWP does look at the fish data that way. FWP doesn't do, they don't actively do a lot of invertebrate sampling. There are others that do invertebrate sampling. USGS has an invertebrate sampling program. The EPA contracts with a consultant to do to collect invertebrates and calculate bioindices. So depending on different ratios of species of bugs. So there's some bugs that are more sensitive to metals, say, than others, based on those ratios. That's one way that they are tracking the progress of the cleanup and seeing those changes in the bug community over time.
The reason, this Steve Hill, the reason I ask is, I know years ago when I lived in Idaho, we had 2 years of real severe fires near the South Fork of the Boise. The soot covered the bottoms of the stream to the extent that we had pretty dramatic fish loss just in the South Fork. And that's kind of an annual event anymore. I'm just wondering if anyone had tried to correlate fire season with fish mortality or macroinvertebrate.
The sampling is done, like once a year, so it's like an annual data point. That said, there is a researcher that works on a program that we work a lot with called the Cruise program. He's at MSU and he's doing an in-depth study of the inverts in the Upper Clark Fork River. He was sampling them every month. So I'm really interested to see what the results of his PhD project are.
Yeah.
We have yet to see results.
Can I get his name? And
His name is Jose, I can't remember his last name.
Jose, that's me.
It's Jose.
I'd be interested.
But yes, we can share it.
Is that would be part of it?
Okay, Doug asked me to talk about the Upper Clark Fork Working Group, which is something we've been leading and participating in for several years now. And part of that working group is the university program. And one of our collaborators in the working group, Maury Vallette, he put together a rather large natural science fund, National Science Foundation grant, where he and other university professors have gotten a whole bunch of different graduate projects on the Upper Clark Fork River. And we're really glad to see that because just a few years ago, back 2014, there's very few or no graduate students working on it. So now we have dozens, it seems like. And that's one part of the working group. The other part of the working group is really anyone doing monitoring, collecting data. Anybody that works on the Upper Clark Fork can go to these meetings and present what they're working on or listen to what other folks are working. It's just a way for us to share information.
So this is Doug, add on to, so this started as, we're trying to, getting at what you're getting at, is anybody looking at invertebrates? Fish, Wildlife and Parks isn't, but there are others are. And that's the whole focus that we are trying to get with this working group is that, FWP doesn't necessarily have to collect that information because others are. We just need to know who to share it with.
With the data.
Yeah. One other point that I would like to stress a little bit, and then we'll go to, we got a break on the agenda, but the fish workshop that we developed we held last year was in response to a lot of the data that Nathan and his partners at Fish, Wildlife and Parks have collected, because we're implementing these restoration projects and we're watching the fish population or the trout population in the Clark Fork go down. That's not the trend that we were looking for. So from our standpoint, from the Natural Resource Damage Program standpoint, we wanted to make sure we were spending the money on the right thing. And so actually working with the working group and then bringing in these experts and sitting down and talking with everybody about what we were doing, what information was out there, trying to figure out what's going on, was very helpful to us. The trend was, or the discussion at the meeting was, and as Nathan said, there were a lot of very smart people there, that in general, we are doing the right thing. This is more of a regional thing, or what we're doing isn't, negatively impacting it. There's a lot of other factors that, affecting the trout population in the Clark Fork at this point. So our goal is to hold that meeting again this year, and go over and talk about if there's anything new going on. So it is the working group is something that I have found to be very helpful in sharing information, that others are collecting. That there's a lot of information out there.
This is Christy Beal. Is there like a running list of those who attend the meeting that you're referring to? I guess I'm wondering, sort of thinking bigger picture, when I was at the Elk Foundation, we did a mapping of various ecological factors, I guess, from whether it was elk or wolves or soil studies or whatever. We tried to find as much data as we could. It was a big picture thing. And we did some mapping and overlays so you could look at, okay, and being able to do that over time. Maybe it seems like something that's happening right now isn't, the fish population maybe isn't responding as quickly as we hope, but maybe that's because it just needs more time, because look at, here's what the macroinvertebrates are doing there. So maybe we just need time. There's just so many factors ecologically that the more we can overlay them, the more, the closer to the truth we're getting in our monitoring efforts.
This Doug, yeah, Chrissy, that's a good point. That's what we would like to get to. You know, there's a lot of different people, and the hope is that we can get everybody, you know, kind of the Rubik's Cube of everybody lined up, and so the information is passing through them.
If there's somebody organizing that.
That particular study, well, actually, I'm gonna look at Nathan and Fish, Wildlife and Parks, because there are some studies and some things that they are looking at. You know, for instance, one of the issues that came out of that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nathan. One of the things that came out of their workshop is, you know, is should we be looking at the spawning areas where the eggs are laid and the fry are being hatched. And where are those in retrospect to other issues that are going on the Clark Fork? Where's the groundwater coming up? You know, is that, you know, what's the water quality of the groundwater? Where is it in relation to tailings and that type of thing that where there's issues or issues with temperature and that type of thing. So we are working on that. Do we actually have a strategic plan for that? No, not necessarily, but it is something that we are working toward, because we do feel that in order for us to be successful, that trout population needs to be successful.
Is there somebody like, this is Christy Beal, is there a point person like that is, when you say we are working on that, is there a point person that's like sort of, or do we need to talk to somebody so that we can get a point person funded?
Well, yeah, Nathan would love to do it.
I would say that Doug and Maury Villette have led the working group now for years, and that group is broader than just fish. I mean, it's, like I said, everybody working in Maple Park worked in chemistry to birds to you name it. The fish group which we had the meeting this spring is kind of a offshoot from that, much more focused on let's just look at the fish. So the point person on the bigger group has really been Doug and Maury. I know Maury is, he's kind of backing off and I don't know that, you know, how much time Doug has to do that. So he does need some help, whether it's going to be me leading that into the future. I can say if I need it, it's going to have a fish focus, just to be warned.
Well, I just thought it was, and this is Steve Hill, I just thought it was interesting when you said that there was a broad fish decline or trout decline in Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And so are there any investigations on why that is occurring? Because that might solve part of the problem here.
Well, that study that I mentioned there, you know, they did some modeling, and based on, you know, whatever data they could get their hands on, they looked at flows and flow conditions. And that, you know, that came out as all the things they looked at. Repeated years of bad flows can really hammer these populations. Like I said, the Clark Fork has its own stuff going on, and we need to look at in the broader context, but also as its own. I don't know that what FWPs, if they have a follow-up to that study going on, or if the individual biologists on their individual rivers are, you know, kind of following on it. Certainly, that's what we're doing on the Clark Fork. We're following up specifically on the Clark Fork with FWP, looking at the early life history, so the young fish, because that's really where FWP has figured out is lacking from the population. We're just not getting any young fish back in the population. Primarily just big old trout and that. Yes.
This is Billy. This might be a dumb question, but how do you look at how recreation impacts those numbers? Is there a way to track that?
Great question, and that was something in other watersheds that was part of that FWP study. It wasn't in the Clark Fork as well, but fishing, and you're specifically talking about fishing and
Yeah.
I would think. Fishing pressure in the upper Clark Fork is pretty low compared to other area rivers. And so it's probably not having a population level effect. That doesn't mean that there isn't hooking related mortality happening, but it's probably not hitting the population on a big population. Yeah. Whereas in other rivers, the Big Hole comes to mind. They've actually implemented fishing restrictions in response to the population traps because there is enough fishing pressure going on in places like that where they thought it was a good idea to go ahead and make some restrictions.
Yeah, this is Fish Well at the Park. So I don't know a lot of the details of those studies, but I can follow up and see if they've been kind of the current state of thinking and where the next steps might lie. I mean, I know, you know, when we're doing work on, you know, specific work on hook scarring, for example, or I know of a study in the South Fork of the Flathead that's getting a lot of use, and they really didn't find impacts on the fish from repeated catches, but and a lot of what drives the efforts to limit angling and such on other rivers is social as well as just the resource. So there's a lot to sort of unravel there, and I can't do it for you here, but I'd have to dig a little deeper into what some of our fisheries folks have found.
Good question.
Additional questions for Nathan?
Alex.
Just a real quick one. So, a question I have is you showed some of the tributary data that showed, at least in the upper Clark Fork, some of the tributaries are doing pretty well. You showed Flint Creek and you showed some of Harvey Creek and some of those others. So if the tributaries are doing well, do you have any guesses or hypotheses as to why the main stem's not following that trend?
Yes, I do have some hypotheses on the stuff. And some of the tributaries seem to be linked to what's going on in the main stem too. So Lower Armstrong's Creek kind of tracks what's going on in the main stem a little bit because fish migrate between those two places. I think for the most part, tributaries are cooler. They have, I say that, but some of the tributaries are pretty good on the low conditions too. There's spots like Flint Creek where, yeah, flow's a limiting factor there for sure, but the trout population is doing great there. So maybe there's a lesson there. We can learn about, you know, why can brown trout be at 800 fish per mile in Flint Creek and 100 fish per mile in the Main Stem River. Can both be limited by flow conditions. So I think there's limiting factors in the Upper Clark Fork River are unique to the river. I'm not going to go and list them all. I think we're all somewhat aware of them, but.
If there aren't any more questions, we will take a quick 10-minute break.
Yeah, it is. Yep, 10 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Run down. Depending on the size.
A lot of, but I just feel like such a room for the project. That is almost more important than the resource. Because most landowners, that's great, but they
Okay.
We're on time.
Yay.
2:30.
Right.
Yeah. All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ray Vinke. I'm a scientist and project manager. I work on terrestrial projects in the Upper Clark Fork, as well as taking some responsibilities for working in the Anaconda Uplands. So I'm going to be speaking to you about terrestrial projects, work that we've accomplished predominantly with the Upper Clark Fork River Basin restoration funds. And first I'll start out outlining our goals in the restoration plans and the 2012 restoration plans. I'll also speak to our ongoing work, updates, and touch on what we've been doing for monitoring. So one thing I will note is that this is going to be, there were a number of projects that were accomplished before the restoration plans were completed. And this conversation and presentation is limited to what's been accomplished after the restoration. So we had a grant cycle for approximately a decade. I don't know if there's really that. But, all right, so going forward. I'm working. Oh, I can tell.
Wake his computer back up.
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize. Sleeping machine. I can advance it that way too.
No, but now you should be able to, now you should be able to.
Okay. Here we go. All right, so our goals outlined in the restoration plans were to protect and conserve high priority lands. Overall, we're looking to replace and restore lands that were damaged by operation of Anaconda smelter in the mines. And we're have been able to do that by public acquisitions of properties, specifically in this case, some additions to the Garrity Wildlife Management Area, as well as placing conservation easements on some private lands. We also work in habitat enhancement projects. These are directed to private lands as well as Department of Natural Resource properties. And they're specifically targeted for what we identified as the most important and unique priority habitats in the Upper Clark Fork. So those are riparian habitats as well as native grasslands and some forest types. Monitoring and data gathering is also an important aspect of what we look to accomplish with the terrestrial resource funds.
And again, I'll touch on that this week. All right, so we started the restoration plan. That was developed after similar to what we did with aquatics. We developed a prioritization of habitats and place to work landscapes throughout the watershed. You can see here, you guys also have this in this packet. But we identified the highest priority lands, 8 different landscapes to provide the landscape into, as well as all the upper Clark Fork and riparian systems because of the importance of riparian systems to ecosystems as a whole. We identified these priority habitats in cooperation with Fish, Wildlife and Parks and almost a dozen other cooperators. So, but since funds are always limited, we had to decide where we're going to work, both at a watershed scale and as well as habitat types. All right, so this map here shows you basically all the lands projects that we've developed since the 2012 restoration plan. There were 3 conservation easements, which we've helped to fund. Bucksbaum near Maxville, as well as the Gravely Conservation Easement and Dry Cottonwood Conservation Easement. Also, I'll touch on the Clark Fork River Ranch, which is state property managed by Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and additions to the Garrity Wildlife Management Area, which is owned and managed by Fish, Wildlife and Parks. So in total, we've funded conservation of almost 13,000 acres of private lands. And one thing Maggie mentioned, revisit this, but what is the benefit to private landowners of working with NRDP, right? So in the case of funding of conservation easements, there are 3 private landowners as well as the Clark Fork Coalition, as you know. And funding of conservation easements has allowed those landowners to, in some cases, gravely, to purchase additional lands to keep their, enhance their operations. That's a key component, to essentially additional revenue that's still consistent with funding working landscape. So, all right, so as far as conservation easements, the monitoring is accomplished by the holders, those easements, which in these cases include Five Valleys Land Trust and the Montana Land Alliance. So in 2022, I did accompany those parties on all their monitoring visits. We didn't find any activities that were incompatible with the easements. All the ongoing ranch operations are meeting our restoration goals, which are to conserve high priority habitats and allow for opportunities for restoration. So one very important part of our conservation easements is that they do require hunter access. And in total in 2021, there were 3,446 hunter days provided on block management areas that were associated with these conservation easements. I did work with the new holders, the Clark Fork River Ranch. This summer, they worked with NRDP to pull down a high fence that was protecting remediation work on the river and replace it with fencing that's more compatible with wildlife passage. For next year, I'm discussing with them the opportunity to do some thinning on the Dry Cottonwood Ranch, which I guess is here by the Forcella Ranch, really, since they're the owners. But we're gonna thin encroaching conifers from some aspen stands and grasslands on their property, and then use those conifers as coarse woody debris to work on remedial actions along the river. So, there's been a call for having more structure in the river as we take remedial actions. And this is going to be a really nice complementary activity. We'll be able to accomplish restoration, thinning, native grasslands, at the same time work, to enhance remedial activities. A little bit of a side, but important. Since the restoration plan, NRDP paid for three additions, the Garrity Wildlife Management Area. They all protect variously riparian habitats or native grasslands, retaining and enhancing habitat for big game populations as well as native fisheries and non-game species. Fish, Wildlife and Parks is responsible for all the ongoing operations and maintenance as well as monitoring of those additions to Garrity, and they completed that in 2022. So this is an example of Garrity and the conservation easements of acquisition of equivalent resources, right? So we know that mining and smelting in the watershed, damaged native habitats, and as part of the natural resource program's mission, we run to restore some of those habitats to baseline conditions and also acquire equivalent resources to what were lost. So that's what our lands projects enable us to do. All right, so the Clark Fork River Ranch, it's kind of a unique opportunity that was presented to the Natural Resource Damage Program. It's a state property, which is managed by us, and its purchase really had multiple positive benefits. One is it's going to facilitate cleanup of the river, because with the state owning the ranch itself, there isn't a need to either lease access to the river or to coordinate with landowners directly. But in this case, we can just get to work with DEQ accomplishing remedial work along the river during the cleanup. At the same time, we can provide hunter access to that land. There's public access along 5 miles of the river for fishing. And it will allow us to work on that property, to work on habitat enhancement projects. So in 2022, we worked with a consultant to develop a ranch management plan that's still ongoing, as well as direct grazing on that property. The Clark Fork River Ranch, we do allow grazing on that property by a neighbor. Brian mentioned briefly that we've been pursuing split season leases on the Clark Fork River Ranch. Basically, we exchanged the opportunity for them to crop and hay for them to leave some water in the river when we have low flows. So monitoring on the Clark Fork River Ranch, we're monitoring range condition to assure that we can still graze it, monitoring crop production, and then water use. Yeah, please.
I was just an off question, but who are you working with for that management plan? Can I ask that?
Of course. Yeah, GM Consulting, they provide us a lot of technical services, and really excellent to work with. Dude, is that good or? All right, so habitat enhancement projects we've accomplished since the restoration plan. Since we've begun implementation of the restoration plan, habitat enhancement projects on 6 ranches, as well as 5 DNRC parcels. Actually, did I get that wrong? Oh, it's 6 private ranches as well as 5 DNRC parcels. And the goal in those cases is within prioritized habitat types to improve their condition for the extent of important habitat types. So we do this by redistributing cattle grazing across the landscape, by enhancing aspen stands, by trying to control weeds. Those are all types of enhancement projects. To go to Maggie's point, which I think really is something good that the program can focus on, is what is the benefit to the landowner, not just the resources. In terms of habitat enhancement, if landowners are able to move cattle off the creek bottom, they can have additional range in the uplands that they weren't able to utilize. So there's a benefit to the landowner there in terms of expanding where they can graze. So in 2022, we worked on 2 DNRC portion sections, which are leased by private landowners. We did a spring development in Rock Creek, north of Phosphate, as well as some aspen thinning there. And west of Phillipsburg, we built some water gaps and some fencing along North Fork of Flint Creek. So those were opportunities that present themselves to enhance riparian condition while redistributing capital. We have 3 projects in various stages of planning for next year and beyond. One thing that's really important to note with the habitat enhancement projects is they rely on partnership with the Watershed Restoration Coalition and also Trout Unlimited on some projects. And we've got 3 projects in development, both in the Deer Lodge and the Garnet landscapes. Those would include substantial thinning of conifers out of grasslands and aspen stands. Again, Maggie, so I'm just coming back to this. But right, when we remove conifers from grasslands, we're enhancing the condition of those grasses as well as the extent of them, which is a benefit to landowners.
And is there any,
Yeah.
Maggie Schmidt here, is there any value in usually what you're thinning as for the landowner, or is that just something that's covered and then the materials just?
Good question. Typically, it's juniper and non-commercial grade timber, so there's not value to the landowner. But actually, there might be value to the natural resource damage program, like I mentioned on the dry cottonwood easement. But usually it's non-commercial. Yeah, so those projects may include off-stream water development as well as riparian plantings, weed control. But we really rely a lot on our partners as well as the landowners themselves to identify opportunities for habitat enhancement. So as far as terrestrial monitoring, really a lot of what NRDP does, and come back to this, but it does rely on partnership, and whether it's the landholders themselves, whether they're public landowners or private landowners, they've been doing much of the monitoring. So Fish, Wildlife and Parks is monitoring what's occurring on their lands. The Land Trust we work with to monitor if the conservation easements are meeting the program's restoration goals. On the Clark Fork River Ranch, we're working with GM to accomplish monitoring on that property. In the habitat enhancement projects, the Watershed Restoration Coalition, Trout Unlimited, one project, and ourselves are doing mine. So one thing later this year, we will present to the advisory council some results from our monitoring in a more detailed. Okay. In brief, what have we learned? Well, I guess it's sort of intuitive, but the wildlife management areas and conservation easements, we purchased them to acquire lost resources. Well, the purchase themselves in a way met the restoration program goal, right? So when we added lands to Garrity Wildlife Management Area, we were effectively replacing lost resources. Same thing with conservation easements. With enhancement projects, what we've been seeing is, I guess, some treatments are more effective than others. In general, I think thinning's really successful in terms of enhancing the condition and extent of aspen stands and of grasslands. Some of the water developments that I think are a little more challenging just because of weather changes and possibly some design issues. Overall, it's really important for these private and DNRC enhancement projects to have dedicated long-term operations and maintenance. So what that means is to make sure the fence is still up, to make sure that the spring is still flowing and that, sediment is not impairing the delivery of water. So if we're going to commit and invest funds in enhancement projects, and in order to assure long-term benefit, we just need to monitor those. So, yeah, I guess it's really what I wanted to wrap up, but a lot of our, the success of the program is really comes down to working with our partners, whether they be state agencies, the Department of Natural Resources and Fish, Wildlife and Parks, or whether they be NGOs, or whether they be, private landowners. We're able to meet our restoration goals by all working together. All right, happy to take any questions. Yeah, Steve.
Do you monitor for invasives?
I guess it depends on the property, right? In the case of the Clark Fork River Ranch, GM's doing a really great and detailed mapping of what we have for invasives. On the WMA's, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, it's doing the same thing, so.
Billy, did you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I sort of wanted to follow up on what Christy Beal, on what Steve had asked, are you seeing any data or trends in your, with respect to the weed invasives? Any trends or data that you're seeing that are more encouraging or less encouraging perhaps, with respect to any particular invasive? Means there was a time when we didn't have, there was a time when none of us knew what leafy spurge was.
Right, it was a time when the Bitterroot didn't even have an apple, so,
It hasn't now.
I mean. NRDP is not doing like watershed level or even ranch level monitoring of weed distribution, so, you know. I guess. Yeah, I mean, we're gonna look to enhance some of our detailed monitoring, and I think that certainly would be an element of that.
Other local weed control.
Yeah, yeah, that's more where that interface occurs, is the conservation districts. So, or Fish, Wildlife and Parks and the WMAs, or landowners themselves on their properties. Yeah, go ahead, Doug.
This is Doug Martin. So we are doing some weed control, but in the past, there has been a big concern about the restoration funds being used for weed control in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin, because you could take our whole fund and put it into weed control in the Upper Clark Fork River Basin and you still have a weed problem. That's why what we have leaning toward, and because of the research that's been presented to us that it's effective, is just doing biological weed control, just using bugs. So that's where we have gone to. We have not gotten, the only place that we will actually take active weed control, like spraying or something like that, or if we have a project. So prior to an aquatics project or on the Clark Fork River Ranch, we will do active weed control. We control the weeds prior to the project, and then post-project do some, but weeds are
awful.
Yeah, they're a big issue, and as I said, there was a conclusion a long time ago that you could take the whole $120 million at that time and spend it on weed control, and you're still gonna have a weed problem. So we have tended away from the weed issue.
But when you monitor the health of the habitat.
It's intrinsically related to weeds, right?
Right,
Yeah. You can then do something about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Seems like that Maggie Schmidt could do some really interesting studies if they do a lot of river ranch or I don't know. It seems like there's opportunity there to do like cutting edge projects with like grazing or crop management that could be open, for public eyes.
Yeah, absolutely, and I don't know if I'm assuming you mean the Deer Lodge River.
Yes.
It's
Sorry, I
privately
don't know.
held as opposed to the Clark Fork.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think First Ellis would be open to that. They're really.
No, I mean the
You-
state, yeah, yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yes, and I think we're setting the stage to do that.
Yeah.
With GM right now, they're gathering really detailed information on baseline conditions and impacts of grades and so forth. So, yeah, I think that's gonna go.
I guess one of the things I was getting at, tying into, this is Christy Beal, tying into what Maggie was just talking about, is I know that there are studies that show that weeds can actually be more prolific in areas where there is no hoof action. And that's a ranch that doesn't have to support a family, so there doesn't have to be X number of heads per acre. That's the opportunity I think you were talking about, is could it be there's some interesting opportunities for research there.
Yeah, we have talked about doing exclosures there. The property is being grazed, right, just to be clear, and that's split seas lease by the neighbors. But we've planned on putting some exposures in that hasn't occurred yet. Well, in those cases, certainly we monitor distribution of weeds and changes with and without grazing pressure.
Any other questions from council or public? All right.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rec project, right?
Oh, I do.
Ray's gonna finish up with the rec project.
Sorry about that. Forgot. Yeah, so just a quick update on recreation projects and what were accomplished in 2022. There were originally 6, I believe, 6 recreation projects identified in the Upper Clark Fork, and we've accomplished 4 of those, which is pretty, yeah, more than half. In 2022, Powell County was able to complete the Yellowstone Trail. It's 11 miles of trail in between Garrison and Deer Lodge. That's a significant accomplishment. It's gonna allow use of, along the river corridor where there was once was the entirety of it a rails to trails. So anyway, so public's gonna be able to use the Yellowstone Trail, which is along the old railroad, by the way. So that was completed in 2022. Monitoring Milltown State Park, that continues to, as I understand, on an annual basis, have just more and more use every year as people identify, become aware that it's there. So Fish, Wildlife and Parks monitors that property and manages it. That's ongoing and was in 2022. As far as the fishing access sites, there are 2 that we're looking to work with Fish, Wildlife and Parks to construct right in the Deer Lodge area in the next year or so. One would be near the vet clinic and the other further downstream at Grand or Coors Bend. But anyway, yeah, good progress there.
That's a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Steve Hill, on the Old Yellowstone Trail,
Sure.
the NRDP funded the construction. Who manages it? Who maintains it?
Okay, I am going to pass that question because it's not my project. Go ahead, Doug. Yeah, go ahead, please, Sydney, she is the project manager. Well, Powell County is what I was gonna say, but I wasn't sure.
Hi, Amanda Schooley, I'm the planning director for Powell County, and so I oversee the Powell County Parks Board, which is a volunteer organization. And between the 2 of us, we have a maintenance person that is maintaining the trail, and then we work with Sydney, just, I think to kind of upkeep on, the status of the trail. We hope to do a grand opening in the spring, but it's currently managed with county funds, run by our county maintenance and our county parks board.
Awesome, thank you. Sorry, Steve, I wasn't on my feet to.
Okay,
that one.
it's okay.
So that's what I have. Any other questions about rec, or I'm happy to take more on terrestrial if folks have had a chance to chew on it. All right, with that, I give the floor to Jim Ford. So, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Oh, sure. Yep, thanks. Again, I'm Jim Ford. I don't work much on this end of the basin, but I do work for NRD. And I'm gonna do something a little different here. I'm gonna give you an update on the Parrot tailings. I think some of you might have remembered, I guess from last year, I gave an update then also.
And the reason why this is pertinent to you, it's a project that's in view. It's an old smelter site. It's the original smelter in Butte that discharged a lot of waste, some of which I'm sure ended up here in the Deer Lodge Valley. But we're cleaning it up for purposes of groundwater, protecting the creeks. And out of the accounts that you guys helped direct and oversee, there's $15 million that was chipped in for this project. So that's why I'm giving you an update. So originally we had the $37 million project, $5 million came out of Butte groundwater, 6 came out of the Upper Clark Fork River restoration funds. Now, again, that was excesses from the stream side cleanup that under the CD come back to the Upper Clark Fork River restoration fund. And then there was another $15 million from Butte Area 1. So I'll give you a project status. We talk about a major change in the project, give you a quick update on the schedule, and then talk about budget. So again, this is what the Parrot tailings look like. We have the white, orange-white tailings. We have poured slag above it, and then that blue-green water at the bottom of the hole there is what groundwater looks like at the site. So it's super enriched in copper and zinc and cadmium and a bunch of other stuff. And this is what we're trying to stop, this groundwater flowing downhill and discharging into the creeks. The top one. Okay. So here's a quick diagram of the site again. You've got the red hashed area, which is where we're excavating all the waste. You have the green hashed area, which is where we're covering the waste. And the reason why we can cover this waste safely is this waste is not sitting in groundwater. This waste is sitting in groundwater. So infiltration is a pathway, but the waste sitting in groundwater had to be removed. This waste can be capped and eliminate the pathway of contamination of groundwater by infiltration. So we dig up this material, we screen it to determine its waste, go clean fill, we haul it up. This whole area here, this is the Berkeley pit. This is Montana Resources property. We've constructed a haul road. Some of the waste goes to this area called the stockpile location. Some we haul all the way out here, disposal location. In the end, all this material ends up out here. It's called the Pittsmont dump. This is their main haul road for the ore for Montana Resources. So there's some limits there when we can utilize it. And this is their processing facility. So none of this waste is hauled on public streets. It's all on enclosed project-specific left-hand traffic corridors. And because of that, we can use much larger equipment. So this past year, we've done the second phase of excavation. This was phase 1. Phase 2 included where the county city shops were located. So we had to relocate those shops, another place in the valley, reconstruct them, have them move out. Then we demoed all this shop complex to get into our digging material. This is the Butte Silverbow Civic Center right here, just to orient you some. So this is the excavation area for the second phase. Oh, I guess I forgot to have this. So this is just what we finished here in the last couple of weeks. So we've excavated all the waste is excavated. There's still some more backfilling to be done. Then we've got to reconstruct Civic Center Road and all the utilities associated with that. And then revegetate this capped area. So this is about a 36-inch cap that needs to be revegetated before we're done with the project. So here's just some oblique aerial views of the project area. This is from March. You can see this is that black poured slag that we had to break up. So that will receive an ET cover. So there's no water infiltrating through that slag because it does leach contaminants. And you can see us backfilling different areas of the site. That's this light tan material. Then we've got some structural backfill here that's more cobbly that comes out of the valley. And we've got some old asphalt here that we're going to reuse on the site. So again, this is the top of Butte Civic Center here. And that last little wedge that we had to take out of waste was right here. Just another photo, slightly different angle. We had to prep before we could start in this area of waste excavation. We had to finalize an area of expanded parking area for the Civic Center here. As some of you may know, they're shooting a TV show in Butte, and that's all staged out of the Civic Center. And so on any given day, I mean, this day they had hardly any trailers in here, but sometimes there's 100 trailers in there. And they needed an area to park all those trailers and associated equipment.
Did Taylor Sheridan help pay for that?
What's that?
Did Taylor Sheridan help pay for that? More place to park?
No, this was part of our, I'll talk about it. It's part of our final agreement. So we didn't pave it. We blue topped it for them, but we had that in our agreement long before this TV show showed up.
Okay.
But we are just trying to accommodate everybody. You know, they were accommodating, we have big, huge trucks and excavators in here, which make a lot of noise. And they had to accommodate that in their shooting, so it worked out well. Here's another angle of it, this parking area, and I'll show you a figure of what sort of the inland conditions are, how we leave the site, turn it back over to Butte Silverbow. So this is all property that's owned by Butte Silverbow. This gives you just an idea. We remove stuff and sort of cells. Well, we're constantly sampling this material. We have a crew of people that's all they do all day long. So we remove all the identified waste. If there's any clean overburden, and many places in the site, we did have clean overburden. We help utilize that as backfill, and then we move on to the next cell. This is one of the areas, it's hard to see. This is, that what's this called, this word here?
Patriot, right?
No, the road itself.
Oh, Shields Avenue.
Shields, yes, this is Shields Avenue. This is an ET cover. We don't have the soil. We have 6 inches more of soil to put on that. And then we're gonna revegetate it in the spring. But this is an area where waste was left in place. That waste is above groundwater. So the only way that those contaminants can get into groundwater is through infiltration. So this particular type of cover basically absorbs all the moisture on an annual basis and then evaporates it through plants or transpires it through plants or evaporates it through the soil.
Is that center white spot, this state fill, is that a low spot in there?
Yeah, there's a little more grading they had to do. So this was one of those earlier late snow melts that we had. We typically are running in this particular area, running all our water off to your upper left-hand side. So I think the final grading goes on when we get the soils on. So this is just a little bit more details about what these ET covers, how they work. It's very specific soils that we need. We need clays and silts in them, but we have to release that water too in the spring and summer. So they're very specific soils, and we couldn't find them in Butte. It took us about 2 years of searching. We found some over on the Uland property out near Ramsey. And we worked out a deal with Uland's to excavate there because it's about 140,000 cubic yards that we're getting of this specific material. So this gets to the land conditions. This is in our agreement with Butte Silverbow, how we're gonna leave the site when we turn it back for them. And again, it's sort of like for like, right? That's what restoration requires. We're not making improvements to their facility in the sense of they wanted expanding parking areas. That's what this is. So we blue topped it with crushed gravel and compacted it, and then they can come in here and resurface all those areas. We are gonna replace the asphalt that we dug up in our excavation, but that's much more limited. So the other parts of this is they have 2 parcels for redevelopment. And Butte Silverbow is gonna go through their planning process for determining exactly what sort of development on those parcels it's gonna be. I will say that this is all clean material, right? All the waste has been removed. So there's no encumbrances on these properties because of the contamination. So we got the ET cover back here. There are some controls in there. One of the other nice things about these ET covers are that they allow any sort of light recreational use. So you can have, trails, you can have dog parks, golf courses. You couldn't put like a motocross course on it. But anything other sort of light uses, these things can withstand. They're very robust because of that thickness, as well as the vegetation on them can be very robust. So they'll decide how they're gonna use these areas. These little thin areas of green are sort of permanent revegetation areas. They're not ET cover areas. So quick project schedule, completed that north parking lot expansion, got all the waste out. We'll finish out the south parking lot in early 2023, finish up the ET cover. Our big lift is gonna be reconstruction of Civic Center Road and all the utilities. So that's water, sewer, stormwater, electrical and gas, and cable. And right now, our project is scheduled and under contract to be completed in July 2023. So a little bit about the budget. Our original budget was $37 million. The shops alone, as a standalone thing, were 14.5. So a sizable component of that. That was completed on time and on budget by Butte Silverbow. We were more like the funding agency for it. So that leaves all the other parent project components costing about $22.5 million. So right now, it looks like we're gonna be under budget by about $5 to $7 million out of that 22 that we control. And I can go through lots of reasons why we're under budget, but the main reason is because we weren't using public roads with, what is 14 cubic yard haul trucks. That's what you can use on public road. We could use 70 cubic yard haul trucks. So it's an issue of scale and how far you take the waste. And we didn't have to take it that far because of our agreement with Montana Resources. So they've been an excellent partner for all sorts of issues. They know how to move material and what it takes. And that really, in the end, saved us a lot of money. So this is what we accomplished. We've moved about 1.9 million cubic yards of materials total, with about 100,000 coming over on public roads. So that was that ET cover material coming from Newlands. 650,000 of that were the wastes in the excavation area. We also built this 36-inch ET cover area over about 18 acres. So there's a few $1 million just in the cover. We've been pumping this highly contaminated groundwater, approximately about 12 million gallons so far, with a very low pH, very high concentration contaminants. And we're working with BP, Atlantic Richfield, to see about continuing this in the future. Again, this is BP's contaminated groundwater, not the state of Montana's. So we're trying to work with them to develop a plan where they'll continue to control this contaminated groundwater until things equilibrated out from the waste removal. And we'd expect that, we're talking on the scale of years, not decades, that we'll still have this highly contaminated groundwater. And then the last piece is rebuilding, a fairly major road. And of course, we have to build this road to modern specifications, not what existed before. So it has streetlights and sidewalks and curb and gutter and all the other things that it didn't have previously. So I don't know if you guys have seen this before. I'm not going to get into all this. I could spend a lot of time and bore you with how things were funded and where this leftover money goes, but that's what I want to focus on here. So the green circle here is the Parrot project itself. So that's the $37 million. And then we have the funding sources, Butte Area 1, groundwater, Butte groundwater, and the Upper Clark Fork River Aquatic and Terrestrial resource plans. They all funded the Parrot. Any leftovers go back in the percentages that they originally funded the project. So, for example, Upper Clark Fork River, which you'd be most interested in, you guys provided 51% of the project costs. So any leftover money, any savings comes back at 51% of the savings comes back. Now, there's a couple other nuances to this. There's a $5 million transfer from streamside Tailings that we're working on with DEQ to get accomplished. And 2.5 of that goes to Butte Area 1, and 2.5 goes back to the Clark Fork River Basin. And then the other money hanging out there is the leftovers from the consent decree for BPSOU. The settlement was for $20.5. DEQ implements the remedy at Blacktail Creek, which we estimate to be, cost well under $7 million. Those leftovers also replace these funds in the same percentages that they funded the project originally. So you got 2.5 coming from here for the Upper Clark Fork, and you get 51% of what's left over here. That's it.
Material, Christie Beal have material and labor complications, impacted costs
Yeah,
in the last couple of years in particular.
yeah, well, especially this last year, diesel prices, skyrocketed. I didn't get into it, but we had a change in our backfill source, so we're getting backfill from Valley, and that was costing us about $8.50 a cubic yard. We worked with Montana Resources, I wasn't just saying they were good partners, they actually have been. They had a backfill source that met all our specifications, was not contaminated. On site that was much closer and much cheaper, and we could move with the big equipment. That saved us, a few $100,000, if not $1 million. It also saved the contractor money.
Who's the contractor?
ICS out of Butte. So yes, we did see impacts. We did see increased costs. Our bid package, we awarded the bid like right before fuel prices started escalating. And they were sort of, adjusted for inflation, they were like at a 50-year low. But we got through it. The contractors survived. The project didn't typically hit monetarily, but we did have to make adjustments. And in my experience on these big projects, that is how they work. The ones that take a number of years, and this one went pretty fast. It was really a 4-year project. But things like the Clark Fork stuff, the conditions change. You have to make adjustments, be willing to make adjustments. And the key is to do it and still have a protected project, right? Like we didn't leave more waste in the hole to make the trade-offs. We figured out other ways to sort of cut corners and reduce costs. And it has to be beneficial to the contractor, right? Because he's under contract and hopefully to the project.
Yeah, because if he has to walk away because he can't afford it, there's not gonna be another one who can.
That's right. We put it out.
Diesel's not gonna be cheaper for another one.
That's right. And we weighed all that when we were trying to figure things out because there was points where it sort of felt like.
Are you anticipating or projecting increased costs that are yet to come?
No, everything else is locked in and the contractors assured us that his subcontractors and suppliers, like he has a contract for the asphalt, so asphalt prices have gone up. He has that locked in, he assures us, so we're not asphalting everything, but even our little piece is, it's probably $800,000, $1 million worth. And so he feels comfortable that we can finish out the project with our current adjustments. So we had 2 big changeovers.
Are we primarily using local subcontractors?
And as much as I can, we don't control it. Don't control methods and means, but he's a Butte contractor and he's using, he operates in Butte, which is different than the first phase. We had somebody from central Montana. And it offered some difficulties, but we didn't have control. Like it's the apparent low bidder, right? But so far the contractor ICS has really done an excellent job. Sure.
This Steve Hill, in where you're disposing of contaminated material, is that going to be capped? And who's responsible for that in the future?
Yes, I'm just gonna get to somewhere where you can everybody can see. Okay, so right in about, I'm talking from a groundwater sense here. There's a divide that runs approximately right here. So there's a big alluvial aquifer. This is the old floodplain of Silverbill Creek, right? That's why the smelter was here, using the water of Silverbill Creek. And in the alluvial system, there's a divide right about here where everything north of that divide flows into the pit from the alluvial system, and everything south of that divide flows into the creeks. And so everything up here discharges into the pit. So that was one of the reasons why we picked this location. The other reason is, and hopefully MR wouldn't get too upset with me. I mean, they have contaminated materials everywhere. I mean, all this is contaminated. I mean, there's no difference between, I mean, so the issue about it's not gonna flow ever towards the creek. It's always gonna flow to the pit, and you know, pit water's being treated, extracted and treated. So it's already sort of like in a capture zone. And so capping just this little bit where you got contaminated material blowing all around and doesn't really make much sense from a freight transport perspective. You know, it wouldn't be money well spent.
Right.
And I think, not to get off on a tangent, but BP, you know, they have a bunch of work that they're required to do under the consent decree. And they're looking to bring their material right here, same place. So all their material is gonna go in the same place. So I think everybody sort of agrees that that's a protected place.
Yeah, okay.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Check with the update.
So, at the beginning of the meeting, this is Doug Martin, did, talk about that we're gonna, the council and the program and the public are gonna go through and revise the aquatic and terrestrial restoration plans, next year. And the current plan, it calls for the plan to be revised, so here we go. This schedule is based off of two things. One, it's based off of the Upper Clark Fork River, the final process plan. The process plan lays out a specific process for how we should go through and update or develop the restoration plan. It's also based on what we have done in the last two revisions. So this will be the third revision of this plan. And what I've done here in this graph is kind of outlined where we would have a advisory council meeting or approximate advisory council meeting and some of the activities that we would be doing at that time. I'll also talk about some of the things that the state, that the program will be doing. But in the January, February timeframe, we're gonna have to have a meeting to go through the process that we'll outline it better for you. But the other thing that we need to do is we need to solicit ideas from the public. So when we first developed this restoration plan and when the advisory council helped us with the development of the process plan, it was recognized that we don't know all the projects in the area. When I'm saying we, that means the Natural Resource Damage Program staff, Fish, Wildlife and Parks, the NRC, some of the project folks that we work with. So it was important for us to reach out to the public to see what other ideas that the public might have for projects within the context of the restoration plan. So projects within the priority areas to help us achieve our goals. So we will solicit project ideas. We will also present the ideas that we have. We've already been talking to our project partners about some modifications that we could make to the plans to help improve them, to help implement better projects. So we would do that. Between February and June, we could have another meeting here. I've been thinking about this a little more. The last time we didn't, but between February and June, what the program will be doing is we will be working on taking those project concepts, those ideas that we get from the public, the ideas that we get from our partners, and drafting a revised draft restoration plan. updating the plan to incorporate those ideas into it. One of the things that I have been thinking about, that we could have a meeting in here to discuss that with the folks on the council and the public, and get your feedback on, initial feedback on it. Ultimately, though, we will present a draft plan to the council probably in June, and these are all estimated dates. On this calendar, I had a thing, all dates subject to change. Last time we had this, which we were hoping to be done in August or September, and we didn't get it signed until January. So, but you definitely will see the draft plan in June. So, we will provide that to you. So we will talk about this more in February, whether or not we want a meeting sometime in the April-May timeframe, to talk about some of the concepts that were presented and that we're working on. Following the public comment period, the staff will look at those comments, develop a response to those comments, and provide that to the advisory council at a meeting in September. The reason there's a gap between September and June and September is we found that the middle of the summer is really not a good time to get the council together, or try to get the council together for a meeting. It's just, it's difficult. And then following that, this is where you would make your recommendation to the governor on the draft plan, whether you think the plan as presented you should recommend, or changes that you would like to see in that draft plan, and make those recommendations to the governor. Following that, we'd have a trustee restoration council meeting that Christie would represent the council at in the fall, and then with the plan, with the hopes of it going to the governor in the November timeframe for approval. So we have done it within a year before, and it is our goal to push it through in another year. It is a big lift for the staff, so that's going to be a shift in our priorities to get this completed. But working with you guys, we should be able to get there. So does anybody have any questions on the revision process? Kind of high level, but
having not been through this process before, some council members have, but I have not. Is there something that we as council members can do to help lighten that lift for the staff, for you all? Whether it's timely this or timely that, or whatever.
The biggest help you can be is one would be looking at the process and the final process plan, so you understand that. We will go over that again. But just participating and responding or providing us with questions that you may have. Those questions help us, move the process forward. So the sooner we get those questions or comments, the sooner and easier we can integrate those into the revision. So I guess communications, I think we talked about that earlier, Maggie, right? It's a people thing. We need the communication stuff.
Billy Kolaski, are you guys wanting us to solicit any public comment from the areas that we're representing?
You could. I don't know what council members have done in the past, how much they've gone out, knocked on doors. We will hold a public meeting during the public process. So we will we will advertise. We have, I don't know how many people on our mailing list.
600.
So we will send out notices to those people in the basin. We'll also hold a public meeting and present our ideas and the concept that I put out there and solicit public comment on that too. But if you would need help or want help soliciting or reaching out to members, let's talk about that. If we could help you do that, we might have some information that we could assist, and that would help us as well. So,
Okay.
yeah, that's it.
I will say this, Miranda, what we do on our website, if you know of anybody who might be interested and want to get on our mailing list, we do have a link on our website where they can sign up for our mailing list.
When you do this, Steve Hill, when you do this revision, will the baseline be the existing plan? And you'll do like red line strikeout so we can see what's changed, what's been revised, what's been eliminated, what's been added?
Yes. So the direction that we've been given by the governor's office, to date is that, we should stick with the original plan that was developed in the framework that it's worked under, the terrestrial and working on priorities. And in the past, what we have done, depending on the amount of revision, is we've done some red line, or we've actually extracted sections and said, this is how this section has changed. We've actually put together a kind of a table of contents at some point of kind of outlining, because sometimes red line can get really confusing.
Yeah.
So we have done a process where those changes have been tracked. You'll be able to track.
That's the important part.
And long response to a simple question. Yes, we will track changes for you.
Great.
Carl has a question in the back.
Carl Hammond, just curious if, what sort of parameters you put on the projects that you'll solicit. Just kind of wondering about recreational specifically.
So, and then actually, that's one of the reasons I kind of am thinking that we might want a meeting in this time frame here. So for the council's information, during the last revision, so we can allocate funds for the process plan and the restoration plan, those guidelines, as well as the NRD guidelines, to aquatic and terrestrial resources. We have allocated funds to recreational resources on a split between the aquatic and terrestrial, depending on the type of project it is. The last advisory council during the last revision wanted a focus on the aquatic and terrestrial resources and not necessarily they wanted it on the aquatic and terrestrial resources, not recreation. So we didn't fund any recreation projects in the 2019 revision. We didn't, people submitted them, but we didn't move those forward because of those recommendations. So that's where I could see, a meeting in here, looking at the types of projects we get, the comments from the public about the types of projects they'd like to see, to have an advisory council meeting at that time to talk about the priorities and whether or not we should consider recreation projects or not. Thank you. Are there any other questions?
Any questions or any public comments to add? Yes.
Just to follow up on my earlier question and sort of kind of related to the recreational. Would it be possible to see a revised table with that greenway information added to it?
A financial table, you mean?
Yeah, it's the current status.
Yes.
We have on that.
Well, yeah, we can provide, yes, we can provide a greenway funding table, a budget. Right now, that's coming out of the encumbered funds, because they were considered encumbered at that point. We can provide that we can provide the greenway funding as a more detailed call out. I don't think she's talking about this, she's talking about on the finance.
It's just, what of that encumbered fund, how much of it was allocated during the past year? How much was sitting there gaining interest? Just that high level.
Just to be clear, the Greenway Service District does not, the funding allocated to the Greenway Service District does not accumulate interest. Project specific do not accumulate interest. So the money that was allocated to a watershed does not accumulate interest. Projects were never allocated any interest. So the only funds that were, the only allocations that accrued interest for groundwater, aquatic, and terrestrial. So specific projects, did not accrue interest. The goal was actually to try to get those projects completed instead of having them sit there as a trust. But yes, we can get that information out to UK and actually to everybody that on the green line. I have that written down here, so, and we'll include it in future years. It's a good point.
Any additional questions, comments from anyone, council, public?
Yeah, I got one question. This is Bill. For either Christie or Doug, the trustees meet next week, correct?
Yes.
And next Tuesday at 2 o'clock.
Okay. Is there anything this council has rendered a opinion on that's gonna be on their agenda next week?
No, so that, and I should have mentioned that earlier. The trustee restoration council does meet. We give them this same presentation. It is actually a little more streamlined presentation to the council. It's basically the same one. Christie will represent the Upper Clark Fork Council, and Elizabeth Erickson will represent the Butte Council at that meeting. So, but no, there's no action items at that meeting, just like at this one. It's informational.
Okay, thanks.
I guess there is one action item at this meeting.
At this coming meeting?
No, this one's not. You need to adjourn.
Turn it. I thought you were joking, like maybe we ask for funding of that person. Surprise him with it.
Oh.
Kidding. All right, with that, we will adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks.
I thought you were saying action items.
No, actually, that's.